Welcome to a history of Manitowoc's Evergreen Cemetery, Part 5. We are about to tell the remarkable story of Coliseum Avenue and Henry Stolze Sr., and how Mr. Stolze made his home just below the steep south slope of Evergreen Cemetery, where he would grow fruit, vegetables, and flower for a living, and how the city's desire to construct a road through his property to the 21st Street Bridge resulted in lawsuits and the division of the Stoltz property. Before we get too far into the story, we must consider what the land behind the Sexton House looked like before the city installed a viaduct in 1921 and a replacement viaduct in the 1980. As the video shows, Revere Drive sloped down to meet the downward angle of the viaduct. This was done because the drop off down the hill would have been so great that vehicles in the 1920s would never have made it up the hill, and the downward ride would have been like a roller coaster ride. We can see how much the roadway was graded downward by looking at the banks of Evergreen Cemetery across the road. So, without further pause, let's begin our story of Coliseum Avenue and Henry Stolz Sr. Henry Stolz Sr. was born in Saxton, Germany on October 5th, 1837. A very studious young man, he studied the most efficient methods of growing flowers, fruits, and vegetables to the point I would call him a very competent botanist. In 1859, Stolz married Miss Joanna Schmidt in Germany. During their 52-year marriage, the couple would have 8 children, including Henry Stolz Jr., who would become the 13th mayor of the city of Manitowoc. In 1870, Henry and his wife and 5 children immigrated to America. 3 additional children would be born once they were in America. Shortly after their arrival, the family settled in Manitowoc, where Henry engaged in the seed business. Within a couple of years, Henry began looking for property in the city where he could grow his own vegetables, fruit, and flowers and produce his own seed. After negotiations with the city, he purchased approximately 16 acres of land, which at the time were part of Evergreen Cemetery. This land was located to the very south of the current cemetery and dropped off sharply almost to the banks of the Manitowoc River. The city was more than happy to get rid of this land that dropped down to such an extent that no burials could possibly take place on this hillside. Although the city was happy at the time of the sale, it would come back to haunt them 25 years later when they tried to run a road down that hill directly through the Stolz property. Speaking of that road, this is why I am including this segment in the history of Evergreen Cemetery. For someone traveling southbound on the road directly in front of the cemetery, you would now be on North 18th Street. At the crest of the hill, North 18th Street joins and becomes part of River Drive, which is the viaduct that goes down to the 21st Street Bridge. This was not the case from the 1950s to the 1920s. At that time, there was no road going down the hill to the river. Plus, what is now North 18th Street was then a gravel road known as Coliseum Avenue. Before starting down the hill, Coliseum Avenue made a very sharp turn to the right into the far south end of Evergreen Cemetery and continued on into the cemetery for about 100 yards. At the time, this was the fourth and main entrance into the cemetery as shown on a number of city maps of the day. One of the few remnants of that time is part of the stone wall that once stood at the fourth entrance to the cemetery. This stone wall was not there to enhance the beauty of the entrance. It was there as a safety measure because Coliseum Avenue turned so sharply into the cemetery, it was possible for someone in a horse and buggy to make the turn too fast and go off the roadway and tumble down the hill. This was still true years later when the automobile came into existence. The stone fence was there to prevent serious accidents. Unfortunately, there are no photos of the stone fence, but I believe it probably stood 3 to 3.5 feet high. There are still remnants of the wall that once entered down Coliseum Avenue for about 80 yards and was probably made of fieldstone or limestone. Once the 1920s roadway and viaduct were completed, the fourth and then the main entrance was closed. The main entrance to the cemetery was moved to the third entrance next to the Sexton House. Shortly after obtaining his new property in 1872, Stolze installed a driveway at the end of Coliseum Avenue, running down the back west side of the cemetery along the stone wall. After clearing numerous trees and brush from his property, he constructed two storage sheds and a very large greenhouse work area. He then fenced in almost the entire 16 acres with the hope of keeping out deer and other animals that would feed on his fruit trees, flowers, and vegetables he was about to plant the following spring. Henry Stolze was known locally as a truck farmer. A truck farmer or truck gardener is an old German term meaning an individual that grows fruit, vegetables, and flowers for profit with direct sales to local consumers such as grocery stores and other businesses that use his product. Generally, the product they grow is not for use themselves but meant for sale, but I'm sure there's always enough left over for the grower's family to use. Henry was known for the quality of the products he produced. Each year, he would enter his fruits, vegetables, and flowers into the Manitowoc County Fair and was always one of the top winners with many blue ribbons. After several years, Henry built a family home on his property to be close to his work. This house would house his wife and 8 children for many years. In an old city photo of the north side of Manitowoc, Henry's house, sheds, and greenhouse can clearly be seen sitting just below Evergreen Cemetery. The mailing address he would use for his house and business was Henry Stolze, end of Coliseum Avenue. Things were going well for Henry until the late 1890s, when he was informed that the Wisconsin Central Railroad was planning to extend their line into Manitowoc, with the railroad line going along the north side of the Manitowoc River and directly through his property. Of course, Stolze was not happy about losing some of his prime growing property to the railroad. Unfortunately for Henry, the railroad had the right of way and would pay him what they considered to be a fair price for his land. The Wisconsin Central Line did go through and paid Henry $1,700. Stolze felt the land they had taken was of much greater value as he was making some of his living off the land they took. Henry was a fighter and took them to court. The Wisconsin Central was shocked when the court agreed with Stolze and awarded him an additional $9,000, a great deal of money for the 1890s. For the next 8 years, Henry continued his produce and flower business uninterrupted. That was until 1906, when the city of Manitowoc was planning to extend Coliseum Avenue south to the Manitowoc River. Since Henry owned property on both sides of the proposed roadway, he would again lose valuable growing property. Plus, he would be expected to pay for the installation of the road through his property. The ironic thing was that at the time the Coliseum extension was being planned, Henry's son, Henry Stolze Jr., was in his first term as mayor of the city of Manitowoc and was in favor of the Coliseum extension. How this affected the once close Stolze family, I'm not sure, but I'm sure it couldn't have been a happy time. Henry Stolze Jr. and most of the city of Manitowoc felt the city needed another north south route across the Manitowoc River. Once again, Stolze Sr. put on his fighting gloves and refused to take down the fence that blocked the city from extending the roadway and threatened anyone setting foot on his property. By 1907, the city had had enough and issued an order requiring Henry to remove his fence. When he refused to comply, the city came in and removed the fence. With this action, Henry filed suit in court, which pretty much stopped the city from extending the roadway. He contended he would lose his driveway to his house and would receive no benefit from the new roadway. The court case continued into 1908 when Henry had the venue changed to Brown County, contending prejudice in the Manitowoc court system. It is unknown if Henry was receiving pressure from his family to settle the matter, but before the case went to trial, Henry settled with the city. The agreement was that the city could continue their plans for the Coliseum extension if the city would open the planned Spring Street, which would give him access to his property. With the agreement, it appears that the city did extend Coliseum Avenue to the Manitowoc River, but stopped there. They would not install a bridge across the river until 1920. With the new bridge came plans for a viaduct down Coliseum Avenue. My guess is that the slope of the road was too great for the traffic that would be using the roadway, and they needed a viaduct to ease the angle of the road. To do this, the city floated a $50,000 bond issue. The new viaduct opened on November 26, 1921. I'm not sure when the name Coliseum Avenue was changed to Revere Drive, but in May 1923, it was still called Coliseum Avenue. Henry Stoll Sr. would not live to see the new viaduct. He passed away on April 26, 1917, at the age of 80. His son Gustav Stolze, who had worked with his father in the business his entire adult life, took over the business and continued to live in the family home. Up until the new viaduct was completed, the Stolze family had access to their driveway and property off Coliseum Avenue. Once the viaduct was completed, that access ended, and since the Spring Street project was not completed until the mid 1930s, Gustav was completely cut off from his property. Once again, on an old city map, I found what appeared to be a driveway heading directly south from the Stoll's greenhouse and over the Wisconsin Central Railroad tracks. It appears that the city or the railroad constructed a small one-lane bridge over the tracks that allowed Gustav to enter and leave his property. Gustav Stolze would continue to operate the family business until his retirement in 1938. He would pass away 2 years later on July 10, 1940. After his death, no one would live in the Stolze home, and the house, shed, and greenhouse were abandoned by the rest of the family. With no one to maintain the buildings and property, they quickly fell into disrepair. They were more likely a hangout for transients and young people. It appears that at some point the property was taken over by the city, possibly for back taxes. The buildings, then in an unsafe condition, were taken down. The only remnants of the once proud Stolze property and business are a number of concrete blocks used for the foundation of the family home and greenhouse. The land where Henry Stolze Sr. once grew his prized fruits, vegetables, and flowers is now completely overgrown and almost impossible to pass through. A sad ending for a once proud Manitowoc family. Thank you for joining me in part 5 of A History of Manitowoc's Evergreen Cemetery. I will continue to add additional stories about this marvelous cemetery as I come across them. Until that time, look at some of my other stories I've posted on YouTube. Once again, thank you for watching.